Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
The Red Apple Media Podcast Network presents This is Protecting America. Now, here's Emmy-winning journalist Rita Cosby.
And welcome to another edition of Protecting America. I'm Rita Cosby. The fight against Nazis and communists continue to this day in different parts of the globe. And Poland especially understands this battle all too well. Well, our guest today discovered his own family's extraordinary secrets that went back generations, discovering heroism and pain, all in the fight for freedom. And joining us now is Alex Storozynski. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, award-winning author, filmmaker, and also president emeritus and chairman of the board of the Kosciuszko Foundation. And Alex's new blockbuster book is called Spies in My Blood: Secrets of a Polish Family's Fight Against Nazis and Communists. Alex, it's so great to have you here on the podcast.
Thank you, Rita. It's a pleasure.
Your family's story goes back so many different generations. I love this book. I've known you for years. It really, first of all, it's a page turner, but your family's fight for freedom through so many generations really is extraordinary under some of the most difficult of circumstances. Take us sort of from the very beginning, when you started learning what was in your family's history and you said, I've got to learn about it, also your brother too.
Well, my family survived Nazi slave labor camps and the Soviet gulags by fighting back as soldiers, spies, and assassins. When I was a child, I came home from school one day and I hugged my mother and I put my finger into a hole in her forearm. And I cringed and I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Oh, well, that's where the bullet went in." And I said, "Bullet?" She said, "Yeah, I was in camp and a bullet went in." And I said, "Did a doctor take it out?" And she said, "No, it wasn't that kind of camp. It was a Nazi work camp in Germany. I was a slave laborer." And eventually the bullet worked itself out. And then there was another moment in my life when her father, my grandfather, was shaving with a cutthroat razor. And I was arguing with a cousin because my grandfather gave me a Polaroid camera. And my grandfather turned around, he cut himself, and there's a drop of blood dripping down his cheek. And he waves this cutthroat razor at us, and he says, "You guys stop complaining. Because when I was in Siberia, if I found a piece of broken glass, I was happy because it meant I could shave." And that was the moment when I realized that my family is different. I was the first one in my family born in the United States. And my big brother George used to joke that my mother didn't want me going into the family business. Now, because my father and grandfathers fought in World War II, I thought that meant she didn't want me to become a soldier. But as I started to dig into my family history, I learned that the men who raised me were also spies. And when I went behind the Iron Curtain, after graduating from Columbia Journalism School to find my roots, the communists interrogated me and they declared me an enemy of the state and they banned me from Poland. And I just kept digging and digging into this story and found out that it was 3 generations of undercover agents in my family. And the secret police put my brother and I under surveillance and they gave us code names. I was Rocky and he was Nemo. And while I became a journalist, my brother became a banker, and it turns out that he went into the family business as well because he died. He was in a plane crash. He was just flying a small plane and crashed in this plane and then eventually got bone marrow cancer in his bones. And as he was dying on his deathbed, he told me about the secret mission that he had done for the CIA.
Wow. Now, did you know before that he had been in the business?
No. There were hints and clues all along the way. For example, when I was in high school, I got a call from a friend who said, there were men here at my house today asking about your brother. And he said, my dad said they're from the CIA. And they were doing the background check. So I asked my brother about this, and he said, oh, no, I applied, but they didn't want me. So that's why I became a banker, because bankers make more money. And then over the years, there were constantly clues. The people who he knew were different than the people who I knew. I was a journalist, so I was interviewing politicians and artists and actors, and the people that he met were bankers and Cold War spies, it turned out. And I said, how do you know those people? And he said, well, in your business, you know certain people, and in banking, I meet these people. And so in 1981, he was involved in a secret mission to exfiltrate Colonel Ryszard Kuklinski from Poland. Kuklinski, over a 10-year period, leaked tens of thousands of secret documents, the Soviet Union's plans to start a first strike nuclear war against the West. And when it turned out that the Solidarity Revolution was starting and the communists realized they had a spy in their hands, they had to get him out. So my brother, who spoke perfect Polish, native Polish, and Russian, the CIA sent him to Poland. They dressed him up in a Polish military uniform, and he went to a party dressed as Kuklinski's driver in a Russian car, a Volga. And he went into the Soviet embassy, and he picked up Kuklinski, and he drove him out of there. He took him to a safe house, and the next day Kuklinski was flown out of Poland to London.
Wow.
And his family was snuck out of Poland through Checkpoint Charlie at the Berlin Wall.
Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
By the way, I want to tell everybody, too, who's listening, if you get a chance, obviously in Warsaw, I've been to the museum honoring Colonel Kuklinski and, of course, what he did. And many people in the world don't understand how extraordinary the information that he had and how close he got to, to those at the highest leaders, in the Communist Party. To get that information, it's extraordinary.
That's exactly right. He had direct access to these documents because he was, the chief of staff, dealing with these documents on a constant basis. He knew the Soviet generals, he knew the Polish generals, and when my brother died, I started freaking out, thinking, "Oh my God, how am I going to verify this?" So I called Zbigniew Brzezinski's office and I said, "Look, I want to talk to Kuklinski." He was in hiding in witness protection. So I was working at the Daily News back then, and I get a phone call from Kuklinski, and he verified my brother's account of the escape. And then that museum that you mentioned in Warsaw was started by a man named Joseph Szajniawski, who was Kuklinski's closest confidant. And he took me to the museum right as it was opening up, and he told me the same exact version that Kuklinski told me, and he even let me record him So I have it from 3 different sources. So it's just amazing.
Wow. Now, when you find this out, first of all, about your brother playing such a huge role with such a legendary figure, I'm sure you understood. You know the history of Poland. You understand it all too well. You know my father's history too. You must have had sort of just chills down your spine. I mean, what a powerful moment. And then also take us to what you learned more about your dad and your grandfather, because you decide to go back courageously and rediscover all these pieces.
Well, those chills down my spine were even worse once my brother died, because I started making phone calls. I started calling these spies that I had met. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the CIA. And I got a hold of his job application and the background checks about him, and you know, much of it was blacked out. And so as I'm calling, I would sometimes get phone calls at night to my home saying, we know where you live, stop asking questions. And it was just, it was pretty spooky. And before my brother died, he said, don't write about me, write about our parents. And what he meant was my father. In 1939, when World War II started, my father was only 17 years old, and he was the Eagle Scout in the city of Lviv, which is today Lviv, because it became part of Ukraine. And so most of the army went to fight Nazi Germany in the west. There were some soldiers in the east fighting the Russians, the Soviets, who attacked from the east. And my father took the Boy Scouts, and they broke into the armory, and they stole explosives, and they blew up a bridge as the Soviet army was crossing. And he went home to his house. He lived in this brick house on a hill. And he goes home to his house, and the Soviets are there waiting for him. And he sees that his father is under arrest. So he flees and he goes to Romania, and then escapes to France, where the Polish soldiers regrouped to help the French fight the coming invasion of France by Nazi Germany. So he fought there. And then he went to Scotland after the Dunkirk evacuation. He went to Dunkirk, and he trained as a commando. Now, the Poles had these commandos named the Cichociemne, which means the silent unseen. And these commandos were dropped behind enemy lines into Nazi-occupied Poland. And my father wanted to be one of them. But he was too young. He was only a corporal. And the officer said, look, we're dropping majors and colonels behind enemy lines. However, you are really good at making photographs. So you're going to make microfilm for these people. So they put him to work for Q, the quartermaster. Like in the James Bond movies, Q means quartermaster. And so he went to work for the quartermaster, making microfilm that was hidden in boots and belts to these commandos who were dropped behind enemy lines. And then when the Normandy invasion came along, he was put on a motorcycle and rode in front of the tanks into German positions and would radio back where the Germans were to the Polish tanks. And after Germany lost, he was sent to London, where he went to work for the Ministry of Interior, which is basically the spy agency trying to protect Poland from becoming communist. And he and his cohorts did their best to try and stop Russia from taking over Poland, but they failed, and that's why he came to America. But even more interesting is his father, who was arrested by the Soviets and taken to Siberia and never heard from again, was also a spy. He worked for an organization called the Second Department. And when I was a kid, my father took me to see Mary Poppins, and I saw a tear roll around in his eye. And I asked him, why are you crying? And I look up, and Dick Van Dyke is dancing as a chimney sweep across the roofs of London. And he explains to me that, well, his father had a chimney sweep business in Lviv. Well, it turns out they weren't really chimney sweeps. They were spies. these chimney sweeps would go into houses and they would sweep and they would snoop and they would try and stop, the Russians from taking over. Now, if you know history, you know that in the 1930s, Stalin murdered millions of Ukrainians in a mass starvation called the Holodomor. It's between 6 and 10 million Ukrainians were killed in this. And then after that, they started killing Poles. So that's the battle that my grandfather was fighting about. And I was told that this house was in Lviv on a place called Green Street. So about 10 years ago, I went back to Lviv, which is today Lviv, which the Germans called Lemberg. And in all three languages, it means the same thing, the city of lions. So I go to this city, I go to Green Street, and I find the spot where my father's house used to be. And nearby is another red brick house. And there's an old Ukrainian man comes walking out of it and says, what are you looking for? And I said, well, my father used to live in a similar house here nearby, and I'm just coming to take pictures. And the man was in his 80s, and he looks at me and says, yes. When I was a young man after World War II, when I moved here, there was a brick house like this. But the Soviets hated the people who lived there, so they blew it up. They blew up that house.
Wow.
And it was a pile of bricks when I got here. So the communists made us build a brick kiln out of it. And all of us, after work, if you were a cop or a tram driver or a teacher, you had to come at the end of your shift and work 2 hours a day in this brick kiln to make bricks for that soccer stadium right there at the end of Green Street, where my father's house used to be. And I was just stunned. I pulled out some money and I said, mister, I don't know what you like to drink, beer or vodka, but here, buy yourself a drink on me. And he pushed my hand away and he said, no, I didn't tell you this because I want something from you. I told you this because you have a right to know what happened to your father's house. So I started walking around that soccer stadium, and lo and behold, I come upon a brick kiln made of red bricks from my father's house.
Wow.
And I took one of those bricks, and as I was writing the book, that red brick was sitting in my desk as an inspiration.
What a beautiful story. What an incredible, powerful story. So, Alex Storozynski, with this context, what are the lessons for today? What would you want the world to know about Poland's fight for freedom, which obviously your family epitomizes so much?
Well, Poland became part of NATO after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet bloc collapsed, as did the other countries, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, and because they didn't want to be taken over by the Russians anymore. And Vladimir Putin has said flat out that he wants to rebuild the Soviet Empire back to its former glory. Ronald Reagan said the Soviet Union is the evil empire, and Putin wants to rebuild that evil empire. And that's why he invaded Ukraine, because Ukrainians want to be out of the Russian orbit. And it's just truly disgusting what Putin's troops are doing to the Ukrainians. And it's just, there's a saying that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And we have, once again, we have Ukrainians being murdered by Russians. We have Jews being murdered in Israel. We have, it's just terrible. This is all happening all over again. And we, motorized terror squads went into Israel to murder Jews. And now the war has blown up to the point where, there's deaths of women and children on all sides. And it's just very sad. And it's written off as collateral damage. And I had an aunt, my mother's sister, died as collateral damage when Nazi Germany was being bombed. So the gravity of the situation cannot be overstated. And we have to figure out a way to stop these evil forces being the Hamas or Hezbollah or Putin's army trying to retake Eastern Europe.
How brutal do you believe Putin is, and also the history of communism, which your family obviously understands all too well? And boy, is that relevant for today.
Well, we have to remember that Putin worked for the KGB, which was the Soviet spy agency, and he's a cutthroat killer. I mean, the way Putin came into power, he actually staged an explosion in an apartment complex outside of Moscow, and then blamed it on Muslim separatists from the Soviet Union. You know, this is fairly well documented. You know, PBS Frontline did a whole special on it. There are documentary films about it. A lot has been written about this. So he's a killer. He's a cold-blooded killer, and he doesn't care what it will take to take control of as much land as he can.
Yeah, there is no doubt about it. And listen, your family understands it all too well. Poland understands it all too well. They certainly understand the sacrifice and the fight for freedom. Well, Alex Storozynski, first of all, I hope this turns into a play, a movie. There are so many different angles to your incredible family's history, going back, as you brought up, to your grandfather, your father, you and your brother. All of you fighting for freedom on the front lines. And I'm so glad that you got to share this story with the world and with all of us. I encourage everybody, by the way, to get this awesome book. It is a true story and a remarkable, extraordinary true story by a great journalist and a great human being, Alex Storozynski. The book is called Spies in My Blood, Secrets of a Polish Family's Fight Against Nazis and Communists. And also, everybody, be sure to subscribe and share to this podcast in a big, big way. Alex Storozynski, wonderful to have you here. And your story is remarkable and so inspiring and so timely. Thanks so much for sharing it with all of us.
Thank you, Rita.
And everybody, I'll be back soon with another great edition of Protecting America. And of course, you can catch me every weeknight, 10 p.m. to midnight on the legendary WABC Radio. This is Rita Cosby, and thanks for all you do to protect America.